foul little goblin had come to the high society ball, eager to cause havoc. He was a nasty, racist little creature, covered in scaly green skin and dotted with warts, and this was his mission. He moved about the hall, spewing his hateful words and intolerant ideas. The guests were horrified, but they could ultimately do nothing to stop him. He scuttled around, howling and taunting, growing bolder and more disruptive with each passing moment. The partygoers were becoming increasingly uncomfortable, but they were too afraid to confront the little goblin. They feared the consequences of standing up to him. Eventually, the goblin grew tired of the party and left. He had made his point and caused a great deal of disruption. No one had the courage to stand up to the goblin and put an end to his antics, and so he was allowed to go free with no comeuppance for his actions. The goblin had left the ball, but his disruption stayed with the guests. They felt violated and ashamed that they had allowed the creature to get away with saying such nasty things and to go away unpunished. Suddenly, a ghost appeared in the hall. It was a very handsome ghost, and he had a message for the guest. He told them that they had to remember the true message of Christ's teachings, that of love, forgiveness, and peace. The ghost reminded the guests that they could not allow hatred and prejudice to take hold in their society, that they must stand up to injustice and fight for what is right. The guests were so moved by the ghost's words that they vowed to never let a creature like the nasty little goblin cause such disruption in their hall again. They thanked the ghost for their wisdom and left the hall with a newfound sense of peace.
What became of the goblin?
Well, he was never seen again at the high society ball. It is believed that he may have gone back to his dark lair to plan more mischief and disruption. The guests of the hall were happy to be rid of him, but it is possible that he is still out there, plotting his next act of malice. It's unclear what the goblin's next act may be, but it's likely that he will continue to spread his hateful message wherever he can. He may target other high society events and try to disrupt gatherings of people who are different from him. Whatever the case, it's certain that his next act of malice will be as destructive as the last. The foul little goblin had been planning his next attack for weeks. He had heard of a gathering of religious leaders who were coming together to discuss peace and tolerance among their faiths. Seeing this as an opportunity to spread his hateful message, the goblin set out to disrupt the gathering. He made his way to the gathering, using a simple dark magic spell to disguise himself as an elderly man. Once there, he began to spread his message of hatred and intolerance, shouting out his views and attempting to start arguments. The religious leaders were appalled by his behavior and attempted to silence him, but the goblin was relentless and he refused to be quiet. The magic of his rudimentary spell had worn off by then, yet still he continued to spew his hateful words, and the atmosphere became increasingly tense. Eventually, the religious leaders had had enough. They had called upon the power of their faith to expel the goblin from the gathering. A powerful force of light energy surged through the room, and the goblin was thrown out. The religious leaders rejoiced at their victory, and the gathering continued peacefully. But they knew that the goblin would be back, and they vowed to be forever vigilant in the face of his hatred and intolerance. Though the religious leaders had successfully expelled the goblin from their gathering, they knew that their victory would be short-lived. Sure enough, the goblin returned, but this time he was not alone. He had brought a large pack of other goblins with him, and they were all eager to cause chaos and disruption. The religious leaders were horrified and attempted to expel the goblins once again, but they were too strong and powerful for the religious leaders to handle. The goblins quickly infiltrated their new gathering, shouting out their hateful words and causing disruption in the hall. The religious leaders tried their best to maintain order, but the goblins were too much for them. They began even to fight with each other, their hatred and anger becoming too much for the gathering to handle. The religious leaders were desperate to get rid of the goblins, but it seemed that their prayers were not going to be answered. Just when it seemed like all hope was lost, a mysterious figure appeared in the hall. It was a powerful wizard who had come to save the day. He spoke in a deep, powerful voice, and the goblins instantly cowered in fear to hear it. The wizard then used his magic to dispel the goblins, and they quickly disappeared off into the night. The religious leaders were quite relieved at this, and they thanked the wizard profusely for his help. They vowed to never let the goblins back to their gathering, and to always stand up against hatred and intolerance. The wizard nodded sagely in agreement, and vanished off to the misty night. The goblins were gone, but the religious leaders knew that they would not forget the chaos they had caused. They would continue to stand up against that hatred and intolerance and work together to create a better world. The goblins had been defeated once, but they were still determined to cause more chaos and disruption. So, they returned on a different night to yet another different religious gathering, this time with an even far larger pack of them. They had spread the call far and wide. The religious leaders were horrified, but they were determined to stand their ground. They had come prepared for the worst, and had even gone so far as to mount an M40 machine gun at the entrance to their chapel, and some snipers in the bell towers of their cathedral, rather than a chapel, As soon as the goblins tried to enter the gathering, the religious leaders opened fire. The M40 sprayed bullets at the goblins, quickly mowing them down and sending the rest fleeing in terror. The religious leaders were relieved, but they knew that they had not seen the last of the foul creatures. They vowed to never let their guard down again, and to always be prepared for the worst. The creatures had been defeated once more, but the religious leaders knew that their fight against hatred and intolerance of the foul creatures was far from over. They would continue to stand up against the goblins and their message of hatred. The weeks one by one went by. Then one evening, at a solemn mass, the goblins returned once again, this time with an inconceivably large pack of the foul creatures. The religious leaders felt that they had no choice but to call upon the most powerful weapon they had, a nuclear bomb. The bomb was deployed from an airplane, and the goblins were quickly wiped out, but the destruction didn't end there. The bomb had caused an incredible amount of collateral damage, and many innocent people had been hurt or killed in the blast. The religious leaders were horrified by the destruction they had caused. They had just wanted to protect their gathering, but instead they had caused untold suffering, loss, and confusion. They had felt as if they had no choice but to accept the tragic outcome of their actions, and to reflect on the consequences of their decision. They knew that no matter how strong their convictions were, that they could ultimately not justify their use of such a powerful weapon, but they had been panicked and not thinking straight. No matter how much destruction the goblins had caused, they had certainly gone very far overboard. No matter how much they tried to protect their faith, they could not protect the innocent people who had suffered as a result of their rash decision. In the end, the only thing they could do was move on with heavy hearts.